Elegy for My Father, Part 3. David Paul LaMontagne, my father, was born on the 13th day of September in 1930. He used to say of his father that his father was born before the Wright brothers ever flew at Kitty Hawk. My Gramps was born in about 1900 or so. And his father, my father's father, lived until we had walked on the moon. His life covered those years. He lived from about 1900 to about 1972. Maybe it was 74 when he died, I'm not sure. And my father identified his father in that way, I think in part because those differences and those achievements were critical to him. Remember, he got his pilot's license when he was still 16. He was enamored of flying. He joined the Air Force, and later he worked on the Apollo space shots. When my dad got out of the Air Force in 1952, it was either the month before I was born or the month that I was born. He enrolled during the next year, at least for part of the year, in Texas Tech in Lubbock, a city in Texas, where he completed at least one semester of classes. That's all I ever heard. He clearly wasn't there long enough to have completed more than a year's worth of classes no matter what. I don't know if he had difficulty. I doubt it. He was an intelligent fellow and reasonably well educated by the high school standards of that time, plus a technical education from the Air Force. I do not know why he left school at that point. Most probably because he had a wife and child and another on the way. My brother Gene was born in March of 1954. So the first I knew of what he was working for a company called Lane Wells that did a specialist job on the oil fields. If I remember correctly, what they did was when a well had been drilled, in order to get oil to come into it, you needed to fracture the layers of rock at the oil-bearing layer points. And Lane Wells would do a job that included lowering a radioactive sample down the well on a long wire and then back up again, exposing all the rock to a roughly equal amount of radiation, and then lower a sensor down it to test where the radiation was absorbed and re-emitted later. And from doing this, they could estimate fairly accurately where the oil-bearing strata were, and then they would fire 50 caliber bullets through the pipe sides to shatter the rock behind it to start the oil flowing. At least that's what I understood. It may be a totally mixed up picture of how work on the oil rigs goes. But in any case, Dad worked for Lane Wells. He did some sorts of jobs like that. The first I remember was when we were living in Shreveport, so I was probably about 5 years old, maybe 6. And Dad was still working for Lane Wells. He had, I know at least once, he built paper rockets from scratch or a kit and took us kids out to watch while he launched them off. So he was still interested in that kind of thing. But oh, and also remember living in Shreveport, Dad was an avid fisherman. And sometimes on Saturdays, especially during the summer, he and a gentleman across the street and that gentleman's son, Cal's father, and Cal, I think, but I'm not sure, and my dad and us boys would go fishing in the bayou with old-fashioned bamboo poles, no reels, and strings, and little balls of food to fish for catfish. And catfish were plenty in those days, and we'd catch a bunch in the course of the morning and be able to go home about lunchtime for a nibble and to participate in the preparing of a big Saturday evening meal. The ladies would skin the catfish and cut them into fillets, and with several cast iron skillets fry the catfish. They had a deep fat fryer for French fries, and we would make homemade ice cream in an old-fashioned bucket that you had to hand crank and take turns cranking it and stuff like that. I would have thought my dad loved that kind of thing from what I can remember of it, but he never spoke about it, so I don't know for sure. He certainly did love the outdoors, and everywhere we went, he got into it. Towards the end of his time at Lane Wells, he decided that he could do better for himself. So he looked to join IBM. IBM was International Business Machines, and in the early days, they were the big name in mainframe computers. And my dad had some idea that there was going to be plenty of computer work in the future, so he looked to get on with them. And he started with them as an electronics technician. Remember, International Business Machines at the time that they started into computers was making adding machines and electric typewriters and all those kinds of office machines at their present level of maximum accomplishment when they went into computers. And at the time they hired my dad, they had just landed a government contract for a huge project, and they needed to much expand their personnel in order to do it. So Dad joined IBM and trained as originally electronics technician, which was what he had been trained as in the Air Force too, remember. Dad tells an interesting story about how he showed up in Kingston, New York, I think, for training, and did not, in those days, own a suit. He had heard that IBM expected people to wear a suit, but he was laying low and scoping out the way things were. Meanwhile, my brothers and my mother and I moved to Longview, Texas from Shreveport, because that was my mother's mother lived, and we did school there. I think we might have done our school there until perhaps halfway through my second grade year, while Dad was studying up in Kingston, New York. So he tells his story how after the second day of classes he was called in by the manager, and it was explained to him that IBMers usually wore suits, and Dad said he'd realized that and he was perfectly happy to, but this was all he owned when he took this job. And the manager gave him 80 or 100 bucks and told him to go out and get himself a suit, which my dad did. So once Dad finished with IBM, they set him up to go out to one of the SAGE sites. The SAGE sites were big radar installations in the early years of the Cold War. They were designed to detect a possible Russian attack by detecting by radar everything over the skies in North America from a certain amount north, so as not to have to worry about every last bit of the ordinary air traffic. And all kinds of radars were built across the northern United States and across Canada and Alaska. And the problem was to assemble from all of these radars a picture, a single visualization of what was up there in the air. And the program to do that was called SAGE. I don't know what they stand for, but part of what they did was at each SAGE site they had two identical computers that ran parallel to one another, so that at least one of them would be up if the other one was broken down. These were IBM mainframe computers with about 30,000 vacuum tubes in each. You probably don't even remember computers that had transistors instead of microchips. But vacuum tubes were little glass tubes, probably about twice the thickness of your thumb, but other than that, about the size of your thumb. The glass tube was evacuated, there was a vacuum in it. It used a lot of electricity to burn electrons off a central filament, and then to use an intervening foil to control whether the electrons passed through to another element to make a circuit or not. And these things were used to make the switching in early computers before the transistor was invented, and later before the microchip was invented. So Dad was one of the electronics technicians in these huge computers with 30,000 tubes in them. Indeed, he tells the story about one time when the computers were offline and they were working on them to getting them fixed, and they got one of them up and running and had it running for a while when an Air Force officer noticed that the air conditioning wasn't running. Normally, these computers develop so much heat that you bathe them in air conditioning. But since the air conditioning is expensive to run, when you've got the computers off, you turn the air conditioning off. So this officer turned the air conditioning back on. Unfortunately, the computer already been running for an hour or more and had heated up enormously, and the sudden rush of cold air into the core of the computer caused most of the glass of the vacuum tubes to break. Dad said you could hear tinkle, 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 tinkle all over the building. And since, of course, this was a security issue, this was for our safety as a country in the Cold War with Russia to have these things up and running. It was an immediate clean it up and replace all the tubes kind of deal. So you have a bunch of guys running around in the innards of this computer replacing vacuum tubes in order to get it back up and running. Dad learned programming too, so that eventually he was mostly programming rather than changing tubes and stuff like that. I do not know how his career was sequenced very much, because the work he did on Sage was in fact classified until the late 1990s or early 2000s. So the most we knew was that he was working for this Air Force site run by IBM that was tied into the distant early warning signals. And that's the sum total of what we knew. All the fun stories Dad told were years and years later. But he must have learned programming somewhere along that way, because by the time the Sage contract was up in sometime in 1965, I think, and Dad had to move to another job, he was able to move to a job working on the contract for the Apollo space shots. So we went to Maryland, settled in the Levittown development of Bowie, Maryland, where my dad said, yeah, there are only 6 designs to all the houses, but they're full of families that wouldn't have been able to buy a house of their own otherwise. So as far as my dad was concerned, that was a good reason to build like that, and sufficient to ignore snide comments about ticky-tacky neighborhoods and ticky-tacky communities. Dad worked at 2 different places around the DC area, I think, maybe 3 over the course of time. But all of them, at least for the time I was there, involved in supporting the Apollo space shots. If I remember correctly, the antennas that were scattered all around the world to reach out towards the moon had to be a certain wavelength to penetrate the ionosphere and stuff like that. And they were known as S-band antennas. And the signals that went back and forth to the spacecraft were not just voice communication, but also all of the computer telemetry was relayed back over the radar and radio signals. Mind you, it would suffer degradation and information problems, but the computer program was supposed to recognize that and kill the data when it was ridiculous and let the sensible stuff through. We were very early in the development of routines for error checking in the transmission of computer data. In any case, at one time, one of my dad's jobs during these years was as an engineer on the team that wrote the software to combine all the signals from all the different S-band antennas and put it into a standard package where it could be presented to the various flight controllers at their desks in a place like Houston, which was flight control there, where you see these pictures of the 20-some guys in the room. Each has a computer console in front of him. The data that was being distributed to those consoles would have come from the S-band antennas with the computer telemetry that my dad helped write the program for taking it from here and distributing it to there. At least that's one of the things that I remember that he did, and I can't swear to the perfect accuracy of my memory, but I'll give it a 90% chance that he was at least involved in the project to do that at some point in time. At another point in time, he was involved in a team of engineers that was negotiating the contract as they worked on it. Sometimes a company takes on a large project where they're trying to do something new that's never been done before, so they can't ahead of time negotiate all the details. So you form a team and you negotiate the details as you go based upon what you've accomplished. In about 1971 or 72, Dad's time on that contract ended and he was sent out to Thousand Oaks on a contract, working again on something probably secret. He spent most of his life in Federal Systems Division. All I know is that we got a nice house in Thousand Oaks. And that's a story I'll tell you soon.